One of the things that I find most compelling is to not make it about climate change. You actually make it about the issues people care about. So people care about their health, right? People care about how healthy they are and how healthy their family is. So talking about health, in the US, one of my most mind-blowing statistics is that if you look at children, when I was in academia, I didn't want to work in academia. Like, if we're actually trying to change the world through academia, why would we just publish papers? Why aren't we actually doing something in the world? So we are going to see the cost of producing meat skyrocket with the impacts of climate change. In Colorado, most of our water comes from the Colorado River. 70% of the water in the river is used for alfalfa, that is cattle feed.
Well, Sarah, welcome to Tomorrow's Bites. Thanks a lot for accepting our invitation. I got to find your profile for the TED Talk that you did in September, and I thought that there were, when I was listening to it, it's like, oh yeah, definitely there are things here that we can discuss in the podcast. So I'm happy that you accepted the invitation to send you after that. We used the first question mostly for you to introduce to our audience, and we like to formulate it like, how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I normally describe myself as many, many things. I'm a social impact leader. I'm a mom. I'm a CEO. And I am highly driven to create change in the world. So that's normally how I describe myself. I don't think there's one box in which I fit into very well. And I've changed my position in work almost every 2 years for my entire career. So I like to remain malleable. So maybe the other way I describe myself is as a bit of a chameleon in terms of changing shape and form every couple of years.
Changing careers means basically doing developing other skills, or also the reason behind basically what you said. You're an impact-driven person right now, but was it already in the past?
I think so. I think for a really long time, I've been driven to make change in the world. I actually found the other day a letter that I wrote to myself when I was 14. And it's so funny because part of it is about, like boys and, being a teenager. And then the end of it says, go out there in the world and make a difference. Like, you were born to go and change the world. So don't hesitate. Go and do that now as fast as you can. So I think for a very, very long time, I've been driven to try to make a difference in the world in one way or another. And over my career, it's just shifted in terms of the types of organizations I'm working on and some of the issues that I worked on that have evolved over time.
When you wanted to make a change in the world or make a difference in the world, was always sustainability in your head, or when did that came?
Yeah, it was not always in my head. It was later in life for sure. I think I've been really aware of inequality in our world since I've been a kid, and lots of things in my childhood where I grew up in a neighborhood that brought very, very wealthy people in contact with very, very poor people. So I was aware of some of the inequality. And then over time, wanted to explore that in different ways. So I actually started doing my PhD looking at things like sweatshops and women's role in global sweatshops, and was really fascinated in the intersection of global capitalism and gender, which is so different than what I do now. But over time became really interested in our food system and looking at examples of inequality in our food system. I actually was not interested in sustainability or climate change. I purposely didn't take the class on climate change when I was in grad school. I was like, I don't know, that sounds kind of boring, and wanted to do more about institutional change, thinking of big systems and big economic systems and how we might change them. And that eventually actually led me back to climate change, because I was looking at agriculture systems and realizing how broken they were and how much they weren't working for the people involved in them, nor working for the planet. And so ended up actually getting into climate change that way, and now can't imagine doing anything else. It feels like the crisis of our lifetime is linked to sustainability and its impact on people around the world.
Okay, it's interesting. You mentioned you were first looking maybe agriculture more from a social standpoint than from a sustainability. But for what I've seen in your career, then a lot of times it's been more related not to deforestation than to the social part of agriculture, although I guess that they go together most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, they do go together. I think that's actually what motivates me the most is that all of these sustainability issues impact people. When it comes down to what drives us and what drives me, it's about realizing that our sustainability is directly tied to people's suffering. If we keep cutting down the Amazon rainforest, it's terrible for animals and species, and I'm aware of that, but also it's destroying indigenous communities. And in the long run, climate change is causing massive, massive human suffering. So I think that's what really drives me is understanding that link between the social and the environmental and that they're not separate at all. The social is often what's driving us to be unsustainable. And then the unsustainable is causing these wild social impacts around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And there you mentioned one thing that I actually want to dive into, but because you mentioned that on the long term, these sustainable changes will be affecting us as a population. But there's one thing always, there's a really problem is that people don't feel it at the moment. So, like, how do you acquire that change? That is always the biggest question, I think. So how would you do that then? If you see on the long term, like you have the researches backed up by that, but like how can we socially change people towards the direction?
Yeah, it's such a good question because people don't feel the impact, right? Most people don't, even when they do feel the impact, they don't connect it to climate change. So right now in the US, it is snowing in Florida, right? Which is unheard of. It's half a foot of snow in Florida, which never ever gets snow. People will never connect that to climate change, right? It's actually, people are like, oh, climate change isn't real because it's snowing in a warm place. Even when you do have impacts of climate change, like drought or extreme heat, people don't necessarily draw that connection. So it's hard to actually make the connection around climate change. One of the things that I find most compelling is to not make it about climate change. You actually make it about the issues people care about. So people care about their health, right? People care about how healthy they are and how healthy their family is. So we can actually talk about climate change in those terms that really resonate with people's values rather than trying to over and over make this connection with climate change. That's a very intangible topic that people just can't really grasp. But when you can say things like we talk about in our work a lot, eating overconsumption of meat is actually making you unhealthy and is impacting your children's health and the chance that they're going to live a long and happy life. People get that. But if I were to say meat is contributing to climate change and that's bad, people are like, I don't really care. I really like hamburgers and that makes me happy right now. So I'm going to keep eating what I'm eating.
So it all comes down to communication.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it comes down to how we frame these issues, how we communicate them, and also who is the messenger? Who are the people that are delivering these types of messages? Most people don't really listen or care about climate scientists, right? In our daily lives, we're not really seeing climate scientists as the people that resonate with us, but often it's our doctors, our teachers, maybe our influencers that we see on social media. So figure out how do we use the people that already speak to us to try to communicate these messages.
And I think since we are in this part of introduction, that I wanted to comment was around your career. And I think you mentioned it actively that you have worked with many organizations. And of course, when I was going through it, I was like, oh, an NGO, oh, a think tank, oh, another NGO. And I was just like curious about, is there something about working in NGOs that really resonates with you, that you prefer to work in that kind of areas better than in a corporate or startup, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I've worked at the intersection of NGOs and startups. So it's always been nonprofit, but very much more of a startup environment. And I think part of it is I do like organizations that are exclusively focused on impact. If you work for a company or even a social entrepreneurship, like a social impact company, it might be trying to do good, but ultimately profit is still a bottom line. And I think that changes people's motives. It changes also how they do the work. And so I'm very driven to work with organizations who are absolutely prioritizing social impact above everything else. So I think that led me into the nonprofit world. Part of it was also just being naive. I had no idea what nonprofits really were. And knew when I was in academia, I didn't want to work in academia. Academia was all about publishing papers to publish papers. And I was like, this seems a little counterintuitive. Like, if we're actually trying to change the world through academia, why would we just publish papers? Why aren't we actually doing something in the world? So I knew I wanted to get out of academia as quickly as possible. So I think nonprofits drew me. And then the other part is I've worked for massive organizations. So I've worked for the World Resources Institute, who's one of the largest NGOs in the world working on environmental issues. What I realized is while they are a great organization, I was interested in more of that startup style nonprofit because we need agility in order to respond to social problems. We have to be able to iterate and innovate quite quickly. And when you have really big organizations, it's quite hard, right? You get bogged down in bureaucracy and sign-off processes and having big teams that can't just shift their strategy. So I was really interested in working in small organizations that can respond to the newness that emerges in our ideas and the solutions to pressing issues.
You mentioned something that it's not the first time that in this podcast it has been mentioned. Academia is not making to take an impact, it's publishing, and people that in the end starts their own startups or their organizations because of that lack of impact. But I guess at the same time that many people goes to academia with the idea that that will have an impact in the world. Do you believe that that is actually possible, or is just people being naive about what academia can do?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it can. So I think absolutely. I fundamentally believe we need good research and we need peer-reviewed research. I think there's a question on how it's communicated out that is more the question, right? It's not whether we need the research or not. It's how are we applying it? How are we getting it outside of academic audiences? And I think that's part of the challenge is that most academics aren't trained in how do you get policymakers or corporate executives to use this research. And instead, the end goal is that you get it in some top peer-reviewed journal, and that's it, right? That's what you get to. It shows up in the journal, and you count your success by the number of citations of that by other academics. So it becomes this really insular circle of academics referencing other academics who have referenced other academics. And so I think that ultimately it has the potential to be very impactful, but it needs to be linked into other communication channels. And that's actually part of what NGOs can help with is amplifying really game-changing academic research. But it's quite hard because that research isn't designed from the outset to make change. It's designed according to the best practices of a particular academic discipline, which often is very technical and wonky. It's hard to understand. It's even structured where, you have pages and pages of methodology before you even understand what the research is about. So it's quite hard to translate it, but it's why we actually need lots of nonprofit organizations who are helping to translate these findings into the actual impact work.
Yeah, I have to say that lately for LinkedIn, I'm trying to do an exercise of going through articles and trying to find things that can be valuable to share with people. And I sometimes myself, I also have academic, not for PhD, but I did a bachelor of biochemistry. So I've been involved in tasks of research. And sometimes it's just like, yeah, there are valuable things here. And I find myself like highlighting many things that appear in the article that's like, oh, this is worth it to share. Oh, this could be content. But then at the same time, it's like, but if you don't really make the effort to go through all the explanation, this knowledge is not going to go farther than this article. And that is actually true. It's quite sad when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's really sad because there's so much time and effort and money that goes into a lot of this research. And then it just gets stuck there. One of my favorite statistics I learned, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's something like 80% of all research produced by the World Bank, which is the World Bank, right? It's a big, well-known institution. 80% of the research is never even downloaded from the website. So they put it on the website for people to access, and no one ever even looks at it. So it's such a shame because what's the point of doing the research if no one's using it, right? It's the old adage of like, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, it's like, if you produce all this research and no one uses it, why have you done it? And what's the point of it other than making yourself feel good that you've done more? Yeah. So I would really urge that a lot of researchers think through the question of who am I trying to get to do something differently from the very beginning and then build out their research accordingly rather than what's going to be the best way to get this published necessarily.
Yeah, yeah. But this is also a story in big non-profit organizations, right? Like I heard similar stories within the FAO and other EU related organizations that create beautiful, like reports on the future of farming and spend +2 years in different departments, spend +2 years in research on this. But yeah, it doesn't get towards the people as it should. But in the end, you also started to found your own NGO. So what inspired you then to develop Madre Brava?
Yeah, Madre Brava emerged out of the recognition that the climate community was overlooking one of the most impactful solutions that we have. And they were overlooking it out of really a culture of fear of talking about a topic that is sensitive and political, which is food. And so Madre Brava emerged to say, we have been talking about all of these other solutions related to food. We're talking about trying to vaccinate cows to make them burp less. We've talked about trying to grow better feed for animals to make them lower emission. But why aren't we talking about just having less animals in our food system? I spent most of my career working on deforestation and asking the question of how do we get deforestation out of different food products, out of palm oil, out of cocoa, out of beef, out of animal feed, and had this realization with my team of saying, why are we trying to get deforestation out of meat and animal feed when it makes a tiny improvement in terms of the climate emissions, the water use, the animal welfare issues, the land and biodiversity implications? Why don't we just have less animals? Because we don't actually need as many animals to meet global food needs. So we created Madre Brava out of the recognition that the only way that we can meet climate goals and feed 10 billion people by 2050 is by producing less animals. This is confirmed by the IPCC and all of their climate reports, but no one was talking about it. So Madre Brava wanted to take a firm stand in naming this and really elevating it as a top climate solution. The other reason why I co-founded Madre Brava was my experience working in nonprofits has always been not great. I have worked under really problematic leadership at numerous organizations. I've caught CEOs embezzling money. I've had male bosses that have taken my work and passed it off as their own. Just numerous issues in terms of the leadership of these organizations. And what I decided after having so many frustrating experiences was that it wasn't just what we were doing, it was how we were doing it. And that I really wanted to create an organization that was driven by feminine forms of leadership, which are rooted in collaboration, in inclusivity, in transparency, and not having an ego about our organization. So part of what's at the core of Madre Brava's identity is around being what we would call movement generous, which is always asking the question of how can Madre Brava support the entire movement around a protein transition rather than just advancing ourselves. Because if we succeed as one organization, but everyone else fails, we all fail. So asking the question, how do we go further together and how do we bring others along with us? We don't need to take the credit for everything. In fact, many instances, it's better if Madre Brava was invisible and just behind the scenes. So really creating a different way of operating that not only feels very values aligned, but also is higher impact. It actually delivers more of our goals by being collaborative and focusing on the success of the entire movement.
I'm wondering, like, what is then the work actually that you're putting in, right? So how do you think that, how do you actually do with Madre Brava, like valuing the impact that you're doing?
Yeah. So is your question, how does the work of Madre Brava sort of capture those values, you mean? Or
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm no longer at Madre Brava. So I've moved on. I'm now with the Tilt Collective, which was a decision Madre Brava made, actually, was to be movement generous and have part of our team move over to the Tilt Collective. But what Madre Brava does that I find particularly inspiring around these values is they use a directed network approach, meaning wherever they operate, it's never about this is Madre Brava's plan. It's what are we doing together in this particular place with other organizations and looking to build bridges across communities of practice. So Madre Brava really is led by climate experts, but they work with organizations who are experts in health or animal welfare or consumer protection and bring different groups together to build that community and then collectively say, how do we align our strategies and our work plans in order to support one another? So I think that's one way in which those values sort of actually operate on the ground. The other is by finding opportunities to elevate other partners. So not necessarily always promoting Madre Brava as the lead on a research product, for example, but creating space to bring in others who might not normally be seen and elevate their voices and give attention to their work where it's actually more helpful to have that organization lead. So you can imagine there's lots of things that Madre Brava could be the expert on, but there's lots of things where they're not the expert. And so rather than them trying to claim expertise in an area where it doesn't quite make sense, like it'd be like me trying to talk about cars and trucks. I know nothing about cars and trucks, but I could pretend, or I could bring in an expert and say, I'm going to give you a platform to talk about this alongside me. And so I think Madre Brava really creates these opportunities to elevate others in the field where their expertise is more aligned with the question at hand.
I had this question also here that I think is quite related to what Madre Brava was trying or is trying to do. But the question is not about Madre Brava so much. It's more about, in general, the NGO landscape. Because I wondered, is there competition in the landscape of NGOs or is really cooperative?
It depends. Sometimes it's very cooperative and sometimes it's quite competitive. And I think it depends a lot on the attitude that you bring. So I've worked at NGOs where it's competitive because you bring a competitive attitude and you try to take credit for things and label it as your own. I do think that one of the things that more progressive green NGOs suffer from is more infighting. So we see that we all, there are hundreds and hundreds of organizations that agree our food system is broken and it's not working. But we end up fighting amongst ourselves around what those solutions are. And something like, no, the solution's regenerative agriculture. And others saying, no, the solution is enteric fermentation. And others saying, no, the solution is biogas and biogas management. And it becomes this fighting of it's this solution or this solution. However, our opponents, if we're talking about food system, if we're looking at big meat companies, the big meat companies are super well coordinated. They are strategically aligned and they intentionally figure out how to agree on how they're messaging and what they're putting forth. And we have not done that. So we actually undermine our own efforts by fighting amongst ourselves, when in reality, the answer is all of the above, right? It's not just one solution or another in the climate world. It's all of the above. But we get caught up in trying to promote one of those solutions over the other. So in my experience, it tends to be more unfortunately, more full of conflict than collaboration, but that's exactly what I'm trying to change. I think that is one of my life goals in my career, is to set the standard that collaboration is the status quo and to figure out how to have those hard conversations around those differences and begin with a both and perspective rather than an either.
Well, you said it. Now you're not working Madre Brava anymore. You are in Tilt Collective. You are working as a CEO. What is the mission of Tilt Collective?
Yeah, so Tilt Collective is very aligned with Madre Brava, but plays a different role in the ecosystem. So Tilt Collective is technically a philanthropic initiative. We give out money. And our mission is to create a food system that is both good for the planet and good for people. So how are we keeping our climate goals within 1.5 degrees? And how are we feeding 10 billion people by 2050? And doing that while protecting the planet and protecting animals. Our mission is really driven by the fact we know this is possible. We know that we can have a food system that is both healthier and more sustainable, but we're simply not choosing to do that. And so as a philanthropy, we fundraise from big foundations, from individuals, from anyone involved who's interested in this area. And then we make grants to organizations around the world who are working on this issue. At a high level, our approach is to say we know that we have to eat less meat, particularly in countries where people are overeating meat to an extreme degree. So not everyone everywhere needs to eat less meat, but in particular places, we have massive overconsumption of meat. And so we need to reduce that for climate, water, animals, health, all of the reasons. But we know we're not going to get there by pleading with people to eat differently. Right? We've been trying this for decades and decades. Like, I remember being a kid and seeing ads about choosing to be vegan, and it hasn't changed anything. We eat more meat globally than we did 10 years ago, despite so many efforts to convince people to go vegan. What we need instead is to change how people are making those decisions, which means getting companies and governments to offer and incentivize healthy and sustainable products. So right now, meat is the easiest and cheapest option in almost all circumstances. If you go to the grocery store or a fast food restaurant, it's meat options that are placed everywhere, and they're cheaper than any other option. So how do we actually flip that on its head and make healthy and sustainable food available everywhere and cheaper, which helps people want to buy it more? It doesn't mean they're only going to buy that, but they will buy less of it. And we have lots of data that shows this, that consumers will choose the healthy and sustainable option when it's made available to them and is more affordable than the meat option. So our mission is that, to change the context in which consumers are choosing the foods they eat, to get more plants and less meat in our food system, and make sure that we're meeting our food security goals while also meeting our climate goals.
So it's changing the environment, basically. I want to dive into it, but I also have another question. Why not changing? Because I think you mentioned, if you talk about meat, it's more the industrial meat. That is the one that has the highest emissions, etc. But why not changing the production of meat then instead of the environment?
Yeah, it's a really important question. The answer is a both and. This is not we only need to eat less meat. We also need to change the production. And there's a lot behind this. So the first part is we can change the production practices to be more sustainable. However, if we make meat, let's say 10% more sustainable, but then our overall production grows by 10%, we're actually zero sum. We have not improved the total impact of production on climate at all, because we have more. If we take cows, for example, we have more cows, but if we have more efficient cows, it's the same as less inefficient cows. So ultimately, the sheer growth in production and consumption will offset many, many gains in terms of the sustainable production practices themselves. The second part is we can make more sustainable cows. In this example, maybe they are lower emission, but it doesn't actually impact many of the other harms caused by the cows. So they're more sustainable in terms of maybe their emissions, but it's not in terms of their water use, or it's not in terms of the animal welfare concerns, or it's not actually helping the zoonotic disease that right now in the US is everywhere. We have bird flu taking over dairy herds. So it helps in one area, but it actually isn't helping in all these other areas. And then the third reason why production practices are limited in their impact is because you can only get so far in terms of those improvements. So even if we were to sort of take out the growth factor, we're still not actually getting to truly sustainable production. It's always going to require enormous amounts of resources. So we certainly need to improve the sustainability of our production. We're not going to suddenly not have meat tomorrow or reduce our consumption of meat drastically tomorrow. So while we reduce the total production and consumption of meat, we also need to be improving the sustainability and doing both at the same time so that any meat that's in our food system is as sustainable and ethical as possible, but also working towards reducing the total production.
Yeah, like there's something around this meat debate, because we had previously as well a guest on a podcast which shed a different perspective on the future of meat, and there he mentioned some things that I would like to discuss, because it got me thinking as well. And then one of the things that you really hear if you talk about meat consumption and reducing the meat consumption, then you get a counter argument about the nutrient security, right? Like the the healthiest part about animal sourced foods, like essential micronutrients like B12, zinc, but also that it is then we have to be very careful in reducing meat consumption with especially vulnerable populations like children. What is then your argument in like this part of it? Because yeah, this got me thinking as well. It's a difficult point.
It is difficult. And the thing that makes it particularly tricky is there's research on both sides. There's a lot of research that shows there's micronutrients that are essential in meat that keep us healthy. And then there's also a lot of research that says, actually, you're just fine being vegan and vegetarian and not having meat. There's supplements. If you become iron deficient, you can take iron supplements. And it's a question of, how do you balance these different research pieces? I think one key thing is a lot of the research showing that meat is necessary for our health is funded by the meat industry. So it's really important to look at who is funding this with what interest in mind. The other is absolutely important to consider that there are vulnerable populations who are food insecure. There are places globally where meat might be the best option in terms of addressing starvation, right? Having some animal protein. However, we often assume meat is the go-to. So we know a lot of aid programs, right, where there's hungry populations and the solution is, well, let's just give them chickens and goats and this is going to help them. But in reality, they would be equally well off if we taught them how to grow peas and beans and other types of vegetable-based proteins. But we, for a long time, have sort of integrated meat into these development programs. So one part of it is just looking at what other solutions are out there and why do we default to meat. The other part is really questioning the science behind some of this. Do you really need meat to be healthy? And there is certainly research on both sides. We know in most contexts, particularly in the global north, that you can be very healthy without any meat whatsoever. And there are many of those micronutrients that can be found in plant-based products that you can access or in supplements as well. It's something that has been really co-opted by many of the pro-meat industry is to point to the health implications and say you have to have this or to associate it with like bodybuilding and masculinity. But in reality, there's just as much research on the other side to show that we are very healthy and we will thrive, if not even live longer, by not eating meat. Because if there are micronutrients, the other part of it is there are massive health consequences of eating meat.
Yeah.
The World Health Organization has labeled that processed meat is a carcinogen. It is cancer causing. Massive global leading institutions are saying that processed meat is cancer causing, and you have people that are advocating that we need it for its micronutrients. So it's a question of, would you rather put yourself at cancer risk to have those micronutrients, or can we actually ask the question of how can we substitute if there is actually a nutrient deficiency?
Yeah. We hear you talk about processed meats, right? So our previous guest also didn't really talk about like the processed ones, but more on the wall cuts that has these health benefits. But you mentioned directly a point that I also hear from the other side. It's basically that funding the research. It says on both sides, but it makes sense, right? Like if you believe in a certain future, you're gonna do your best to do that. Like it's confirmation bias. It's natural thing as human being. And so that argument for me is like, yes, but it makes it so complicated because like if you go for the Netflix movie, like the twins experiment, they say also it's like funded by also the ones that are believing in the plant-based future.
Yeah.
It's like an ongoing discussion and it doesn't end.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I mean, there is confirmation bias. I think our approach is to say there are objective research institutions. And then there's industry interests, which are very different. So when we talk about the meat industry funding research, that means meat companies are giving money sometimes to to universities to do this research. So you could have the same on the plant-based side, right? You could have plant-based companies funding universities to do this. And then you have universities or other researchers who are unaffiliated with either side. And I think that's the question we need to ask is how do we get more of these objective research pieces out there that aren't influenced by industry? It's hard to tell though, right? It's hard to know who's influencing what. But I think for us to ask that critical question of who's actually behind this research and what is their interest helps us examine the findings of the research a bit more closely.
Yeah.
Anyway, also with something that Shako said, that is not that of course they're gonna be like funding, and it's good to check like who's funding, but sometimes I believe that we have that confirmation bias of pointing out that the research of the thing that you are trying to change are funded by people that is interested economically, while maybe their own research sometimes, I'm not saying always, but sometimes their own research that you may take will be also funded by people that is economically interested into saying. So I understand that. I think that for any cause, it will be always good to acknowledge that nobody's perfect in that sense, but also that doesn't mean that you cannot criticize what's done. Also, another thing I wanted to mention that is that what I think that is complicated about the health the health debate is that there is not such a thing as one thing that is healthy. No, what is healthy is always like is always really complicated to put, because you can eat completely healthy or 80% of your diet is healthy, and then 20% from time to time is a pizza or is fast food or things like that, and you could still be considered as a healthy person. So the complication of the health debate, in my opinion, is that there is no such a thing as one thing that is healthy. Of course, in this case, the processed meat causes cancer. That is definitely not something that nobody would say that's healthy. But it's true that depending on what moment of the research you do, you could also see people that eat meat and eventually they are healthy. Like it's a very complicated assumption to make. No, that is like why it's been for a long time. Not like with tobacco, is they quit made much more that linking, but with the meat, it's going to be really complicated because there is so many factors that will affect the processing. A lot of times it will not be the same in two companies for two products or in two different continents. Maybe in some parts that risk is higher than in other parts. So I believe that as much as I believe it's more effective in order to talk to the people for health and sustainability, but I believe it can be considered less evident than sustainability versus health.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question. The health thing is tricky because you're right. There's no definition of what is healthy. We have benchmarks we can use, and one of which we use a lot is dietary guidelines. So governments have guidelines for people in that country on what a healthy diet looks like. And then the other is the Eat Lancet report, which the Eat Lancet report balances sustainability with health and says for each region, and they'll refine it to each country in the next report, it shows what an actual diet is. And I think the question, like you say, is it's not actually saying meat is unhealthy. What we're often saying is eating excessive amounts of meat is unhealthy. And that is what the research shows. So I can eat ice cream, I can eat pizza, but if I only ate that or I ate excessive amounts of it, then it does have impacts. And it's a good analogy with smoking, right? If one cigarette every 3 months, it's probably not going to give me cancer and have other health impacts. But if I'm having a pack of cigarettes a day, it's a different question. So ultimately, we're talking about overconsumption of meat, excessive amounts of meat, recognizing that there is a big difference in terms of where we are now versus where we should be for both health and sustainability. So in the US, right, the average American eats 6 times the recommended amount of red meat. That is a lot, right? We're talking about 6 times, 600% the red meat we should be eating. So you can imagine if you're supposed to be eating, maybe half a hamburger every other day, we're eating at least a hamburger every day. And it's not a question of if hamburgers are healthy. It's saying, let's just eat less of them and we will be healthier ourselves. And this will have big implications for the planet.
Yeah.
I think that there is one thing for the communications that actually the first time I heard it from Shako. So I am allegedly stealing it from you right now. That maybe one thing that we should consider when communicating about health is that sustainability is also health. Like if we slightly destroy the planet, it's going to have a direct repercussion in our health. It's going to have in the air that we breathe, in the amount of sun that we can take. All those things are gonna affect our health. So maybe it's something that when the communication, we can combine that urgency that health creates better than sustainability with the more evident effect of the meat industry, that is the sustainability over our health. Not because I'm not saying that it cannot have an impact, but research has become more clear about the impact on sustainability than in health, in my opinion. However, I wanted to ask you, do animals have a role in the food system? Sorry?
Yeah. I mean, our approach is to say absolutely yes. Like, we are not trying to get rid of all animals in the food system, that we imagine there will be some animals left, and that whatever is left has to be as sustainable and as ethical as possible. That realistically, the problem is industrial animal agriculture, right? We have created these massive economies of scale where where I live, I'm close to the world's largest feedlot, or at least it used to be. I don't know if it still is with China's growth, but it holds 1 million cows in one feedlot, which is absurd. It's so detrimental to everything. Like you say, for health, our air quality becomes terrible in this city when it's going to snow, because the wind blows all of the air from the feedlot down to this. I live in Denver. It's a major city in the US. It blows it down, and we can tell it's going to snow because the entire city smells like cow poop. And it's really bad to breathe in all of the particulate from a feedlot. It's filled with manure, it's filled with pesticides and toxins, and we're all breathing it in every time it's going to snow. You can smell it. So it's really about these industrialized systems that are problematic. There is an opportunity to have what would be truly regenerative ranching with ethical practices for animals, but very, very small scale. We're not talking about industrial systems. And recognizing there's also communities where meat is important for religious and cultural purposes, that we're not telling, religions who rely on meat for important ceremonies or traditions to not have it. We're saying actually there is some role, and we need to be sensitive to those different communities who meat plays a central role. But it's just about less. It's all about less and being smart with it. I often think one of the analogies is around water use, where we have extreme drought in most places now with climate change. We have signs over our city that say about being smart about how much water you use. We have regulations in the summer about how many times you're supposed to water your lawn. Nobody is freaking out saying, oh my gosh, the government's taking away my water. Like, they want me to use less water. They're taking away my water. I want to use whatever I want. No, everyone's like, oh yeah, it is a drought. I can see it's hotter, and I should probably be a little bit smarter about what water I'm using. We're just asking for the same with meat, is to say, yeah, maybe I don't need to eat a hamburger every day. Maybe I can just skip meat every other day and just, maybe put less meat even in a thing, right? You can make pasta that has 3 meatballs instead of 6, or half veggie balls and half meatballs, right? There's lots of ways in which you can still have meat. We're not saying we're going to take it away, but ultimately, I think it is tricky because people immediately jump to that assumption.
Yeah. I have one other thing that comes from the previous podcast, which stuck with me, and I want to talk with you because you mentioned you want to. A goal is want to reduce basically the meat consumption where there is overconsumption, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that he said was that reducing meat consumption in one region, such as the Western countries, could lead to increased imports from regions with less sustainable practices, like undermining the global sustainability goals. And this, as he called it, the leakage effect, highlights the importance of addressing the food system holistically and rather than through isolated national policies. How do you think about this, like regarding this argument from his side?
Yeah. So in theory, sure, absolutely. My PhD is in economic sociology. I study supply chains. Yes, the idea of leakage is true. If you had the same amount of demand for a product and you stopped producing it locally, then yeah, probably companies would start importing it from elsewhere with less sustainable practices. And this applies to any product, right? We've seen this in clothing manufacturing, right?
Yeah.
As a country has higher environmental standards, it just goes to be produced elsewhere. And that's why most of our clothes are made in sweatshops. They just move to the cheapest place. In the case of meat, it's a very different story because we're not talking about only producing less, we're also talking about consuming less. So if whoever in that country, in that state, in that region is consuming less, there is no demand to import meat. And in fact, most consumers are more sensitive to where their meat is produced than any other product. Right? I don't actually think about like where was this sweater made or where was your hat made and that matter. No one really cares and thinks about that. Some people do, right? They really want made locally, but very few. But meat in particular has an association of you want meat from your country and it has a cultural connotation, right? You often go to a restaurant in any country and it will say, if you go to Brazil, it'll say Brazilian beef or it'll say British beef. It has a brand of being local. And so while technically, yes, leakage could happen, consumers don't want it. They don't want products that are imported from elsewhere in most cases when they know it's imported. That's a key part of it. But really, it comes down to the fact that we're talking about reducing demand. We're not naively saying we're just going to reduce production. That our entire theory of change is reduce consumption first, and then that reduces production. But we have to start with the consumer side of things. We have to start with the fast food chains and the supermarkets and the schools that are offering these foods and get them to offer less and different products. And then we can shift what's being produced in each country.
And then I'm really curious, how does Tilt Collective collaborate to do this? Like, do you have like examples of successful cases, projects that you have collaborated and that had like an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we ourselves can't take credit. We are not even a year old, really. And we don't actually do the work. So we give grants to amazing organizations around the world that do this work. So I can speak to some of the work that organizations are doing. So a great example is Veganuary. They're an effort in Europe, but specifically I'll talk about Germany, where they partner with the government and with companies to get people to go vegan for January. And the intention is that this just normalizes the idea of eating less meat. So people will eat less meat in January and then it stays on their mind. They probably go back to eating meat after January, but they do eat less meat and they're more aware of their choice. So what they have shown is that in the month of January in Germany, they see a 10% decrease nationwide in meat consumption. I mean, that's massive, 10% just from one initiative that is very, early days in terms of not many people have invested in this area. So significant progress. And part of why they're successful is because the grocery stores advertise around it. They promote Veganuary. They offer more plant-based products. They often will discount the plant-based products and have promotions for these as part of the Veganuary theme. So that's one example where we've seen really big success. The other in the US is we've seen lots of success around plant-based meals in schools. So talking about health, in the US, one of my most mind-blowing statistics is that if you look at children in the US, 1 in 5 kids is obese, and 1 in 5 kids is also food insecure. And you think, how can both of those things be true? And a big reason why is because we feed kids total crap. We feed them really unhealthy food, and a lot of it is coming through schools. And so there's this effort in schools to say we need healthier food, but we also need more sustainable food. And so we're seeing school districts starting to offer more plant-based options to do both of these things. And to me, it seems like a no-brainer. I mean, most kids now eat chicken nuggets at school. There's no reason not to have plant-based chicken nuggets. They're right now one of the products that is the same price and the same health as the meat option. And in many cases, kids can't actually tell the difference. So you're not asking them to compromise at all. But we have, the entire city of New York now has plant-based defaults in their schools at least once a week. They've also now implemented plant-based defaults in hospitals, which is, you think about if you're in the hospital, you probably should be eating the healthiest food that you can. And so you can still have meat at a hospital if you request it and the doctor approves it, but the default option is vegetarian and plant-based, knowing that people in hospitals need healthier food. So those are two examples of where we're seeing massive success, and you're seeing companies and governments get on board with trying to promote plant-based eating, both from the health angle and the sustainability angle.
Since you're talking about plant-based eating, there is one thing that I wanted to share. Is that me personally, I had like a weird journey with the plant-based industry, because that's my problem with the word plant-based, that I associated to the industry of the meat alternatives. And it's a problem because it's something that it fascinated me at first. Like when I thought, oh yeah, they're producing all these kind of meat products, meat formats with vegetables. That is really clever. But with time, I have become a little bit more skeptical about it, not because I don't believe in a more plant-based diet, but I do not know if I believe in the meat alternatives as products anymore as much, because I believe that you can eat more plant-based by embracing like a more natural approach. Like you have the pulses, you have other traditional foods such as tofu, tempeh, seitan that can give a boost on your protein intake that are also great. And in the end, I know that right now the plant-based industry is a little bit in a difficult moment with the ultra-processed category, because it's ultra-processed, but it's maybe not the same kind of ultra-processed that other product. Like you cannot compare M&Ms to Beyond Meat. Maybe there's like a little bit, and I understand that maybe it's not completely fair to use like one term to refer to all, but it's true that when seeing like the composition, I say, why would I need to eat something that they have done all sort of things just so it looks like bacon, when I could just eat something that is plant-based? It can be nice and it's tasty, and I don't need to go to the plant-based industry. So when you say that people need to eat more plant-based, in what ways do you imagine people consuming more plant-based food?
Yeah. One of the biggest failures to date in the plant-based movement is using really imprecise terms that don't actually clarify what we mean. And plant-based is one of those, because you can have very different products that are plant-based. It's almost like using meat, where it's like meat doesn't distinguish between fish and chicken and beef, and then you have no idea what you're going to get, right? Very different products. So I think there's a need to have a diversity of plant-based products. There are, I think, 3 categories that I imagine. One is just vegetables. We're talking about whole grains, vegetables, eating more legumes, eating more grains, all of those within sort of just existing products. The second is taking sort of innovations that allow for less processed plant-based products. My favorite example of this is blends, where you would have a blended burger. It's a terrible term, another failure where we need to come up with better language. But you can have a hamburger that, instead of being 100% beef, is actually 50% beef and 50% plants. You can use mushrooms. Sometimes you can use other types of proteins. And taste tests show that consumers can't really tell the difference at all. So it's not just plants, but it's a way of having less meat while integrating more vegetables and whole grains. The third option are these novel products, like you're describing, like trying to make bacon out of other vegetable products. There is a lot of criticism of these, and some of it is rightfully so. They're super processed. Some of them have additives to them. And it's, recreating meat. And some people ask the question, why do we need to recreate meat? Research shows that most of these products aren't actually less healthy, even though they are processed, because in reality, most meat is also processed. So if you're comparing it against meat, it is the same health, if not better, in almost every instance. If you're comparing it against kale or broccoli, then yeah, obviously it is less healthy. But in those processed products, I think they play an important role as what I describe as a gateway drug, which is it gets people who are the most hardcore meat eaters willing to try something that is plant-based, because it's very hard to take someone who's a hardcore meat eater and eating hamburgers every day and say, try this kale or this broccoli or this veggie burger that's just a mash of vegetables and tofu. But you can say this is an analogy to what products you like, and it gives you the taste and the feel and the experience you're used to, which gets them more interested. In no way should that be where people stop, right? It is sort of the initial step to get them engaged, and then getting them moving to these other products.
And
I
also, I wanted to ask just one thing, that something that I used to believe, that is like, oh, but it's true that I don't think that these plant-based burgers will ever substitute like the proper, really from the farm burger, because that is something that is really difficult to replicate just by plant-based, but they will substitute probably the McDonald's or like the all fast food. They can become a nice alternative. That is what I used to think at first when with the plant-based, but with time, I have been thinking, but do we need alternatives for those things? Like, wasn't the idea to stop eating like fast food? Do we need also like the plant-based unhealthy version of stuff, or maybe we can just nudge the eat more plant-based without having to go through the plant-based burger? But I agree with you, Sarah. I think it's a good starter, maybe.
Yeah, but there's also this thing, right? This is the biggest question now for consumers. So you can question if this is the right introduction if for the plant-based movement, because now consumers overall are questioning all these ultra-processed plant-based foods, right? That is the main driver now in consumers why they are not adopting these plant-based products, because there's this whole story around that it is unhealthy, which is also study shows that these ultra processed plant-based foods, like it is depending on the basically the degree of processing, but that can influence the health outcomes.
I think that is not completely fair, because the same consumers, they keep eating the meat that is also ultra processed, but for some reason they are critical to the plant-based just because it's the new.
Yeah, but I'm talking more about, like, if we talk about plant-based future, it comes all down about like whole foods.
I mean, the improvement point is really important, because where we are now is with an incredibly small amount of investment. When you look at the amount of money that's gone into creating plant-based products, it's tiny. It's a very, very new industry. So part of it is saying, yes, these products aren't as good as they could be, but let's make them better. Let's make them less processed. Let's make them healthier. I think the other good point you make on this is people are very critical of these because they're new without actually examining what they're already eating. No one's looking at beef burgers and saying this is highly processed. But if you look at the true ingredient list, it is 100 things long in terms of the additives that go into a beef burger, the preservatives, the fillers. It's just as processed, but people are being hypercritical of the plant-based one. The other thing that I think is really important as we move forward is distinguishing processed versus ultra processed. So within the processing, we often just sort of say, oh, this is ultra processed, but there's very different types of processing. So if you look at rice is a ultra processed product. It is distinguished as an ultra processed product because the rice we eat is so different than how it grows, right? It has to be harvested, dried, shucked, etc., before we get a grain of rice. What is different is a high fat sodium sugar food. We're talking about like Doritos, right? That is a high processed, unhealthy product. And so what we need is actually more refined language of what is the problem that we're talking about with plant-based foods being processed. Is it the additives? Is it the high fat and sodium content? Is it something else? And then let's solve for that problem, because we can actually create products that are healthier and more sustainable at the same time.
Yeah. Good point. I found the tactile very interesting, and you talked about basically and now you mentioned as well, like that there's not that much of money in this sector, which also one of the things is that the other sector that is quite heavy subsidized.
Yeah.
And there's a history also behind it. I am very wondering how can we change that, because these subsidies, like now it's an overpedaling, and it's just like additional subsidy on an additional subsidy on additional subsidy over time, right? So how are you gonna, how can we change that? Because the current politicians, they are like overwhelmed. That I can imagine they are like, yeah, it happened over time, basically, right? These subsidies, it's not like once a person said like, okay, here are the total amount of subsidies that we are going to put into agriculture of meat.
Yeah, it's a massive challenge. Our end goal, I mean, one of our ultimate aims is to reform subsidies. And I think to start, it actually is about not taking away the subsidies we have, but adding subsidies for plant-based. So how do we level the playing field? And to level the playing field, if we're bringing down meat subsidies and increasing plant-based, they don't have to happen simultaneously. And in fact, it's not ideal that they happen simultaneously, but we can allocate more subsidies to plant-based to start, which creates far more incentives for farmers and ranchers to transition out of the meat industry into plant-based first, And then we start disincentivizing by lowering the meat subsidies. I think some of this will be inevitable based on the impacts of climate change. So we are going to see the cost of producing meat skyrocket with the impacts of climate change. So in Colorado, most of our water comes from the Colorado River. 70% of the water in the river is used for alfalfa, that is cattle feed. We're using 70% of our water source to pretty much raise feed for animals.
Yeah.
The water is now running dry. It's simply going to be impossible to raise cattle with the impacts of climate change. So the costs are going to skyrocket as people are paying for other water sources. So in reality, those subsidies aren't going to be enough. They're not going to be enough to be raising cattle because they're so inefficient at water use and land use. So I think we're going to start seeing governments increasingly recognizing that the subsidies have to shift because they're no longer supporting the industry. They're going to have to, the subsidies themselves will account for a smaller and smaller portion of the cost of production, which will then, they'll look for alternatives. What else do we produce with the government funding we have? And hopefully what we're working towards is to redirect that towards plant-based.
Great. That is really nice insight.
Yeah.
As I was saying before, I think in this last part, we like to go a little bit about prevision, future. I wanted to ask you, what is the biggest lesson or lessons that you have gotten from working in the food system transformation space?
Yeah, biggest lessons. I think one big lesson is meeting people on the things they care about. Food is intersectional. It is fundamentally deeply rooted in culture and politics. And if we go in talking about food just from climate or just from water, we will never convince anyone to do anything differently, whether that's policymakers or corporate executives or average consumers. But if we can speak to people on the issues that matter to them, whether that's their health, the health of their kids, maybe it's animal rights, maybe it's concern around the next global pandemic, that framing will compel them far more than us, who we come from a climate perspective originally, us talking about it in terms of climate terms. So one is being able to see what matters to people and speaking in their language. I think the second piece is to recognize that the way our food system is set up is absolutely changeable because the way we eat now is not the way we've always eaten. It's relatively new. It has been invented in the last 100 years. And so we have the chance to actually entirely reinvent what we eat and what we produce, and to challenge the assumption that this is the way it has to be, that this is natural and normal.
Yeah.
And then I think the third big lesson is recognizing that there is a lot of opposition to what we're doing, but that we have the ability to meet the opposition with compassion and recognizing that a lot of the opposition is really about the fear of what happens in transforming the fundamental fabric of our food system without necessarily knowing exactly what we're going to. And we know we will co-design this journey with others, but there's a lot of fear of what happens to ranchers and farmers. What are they going to do for work? What are we going to eat? What does our grocery store aisle look like in 20, 30, 40 years? And while some of this we can never answer, a lot of it we can if we actually take the time and invest the energy to having these conversations to help us map this out together.
Yeah, I can ask another one because we are quite over the time. But I want to ask you one thing, what you just said, because I believe also that we can change what we are eating because what we are eating right now is settled in the last 100 years. But one of the things where we are now having and what wasn't there 100 years back is basically the access to knowledge. And I can know basically what happens now in USA. You know, I can search everything. And a lot of these introductions from food that happened over time because in regions, because people didn't know yet what it was. Like lobster is a beautiful example. If you go about the story of lobster, that is an introduction that came from like a dirty animal that was not valued at all to like now a high exclusive animal. But I don't know if that will happen the same, because in a procedure, basically the introduction happened with people that they didn't know anything about the lobster, right? Like the origin, like they had no access to all this knowledge.
Yeah, no, it's there's so many foods like that. I think quinoa is one of those. Who had heard of quinoa 10 years ago other than Peruvians and Bolivians who were eating quinoa because it was indigenous culture? Now, McDonald's has quinoa in some of their salads, right? It's like a bizarre world in which we have somehow normalized an entirely new food that didn't exist before. And so it just shows the potential that we can radically eat different if we put the energy and get the right interests wanting to make this change. But yeah, it's hard because people do have access to so much knowledge that they can start questioning why we're eating it or what's in it, for example. But I think ultimately there's so many different foods that we will eat within 10 years that we will have never considered eating right now.
Then looking to the future, how do you expect, or what do you think that the food system will change in the next 10 years?
I think in the next 10 years, we're going to see extreme shocks to our food system from lots of different reasons, but probably first is climate change. So we're going to see massive impacts on our food system from climate change in all different forms. So some might be drought, right, where we don't have enough water to produce. Others, we're seeing in California, wildfires are massively impacting the agricultural production in one part. And then the other part of California, we have bird flu in our dairy herds. So the disruptions are going to come from all sorts of different sources, but it's going to fundamentally make us rethink how we're producing our food and recognizing that most of our practices and the types of foods we're growing are not going to continue to work. That even if we can force to grow them, the profit models aren't there to keep doing it. There's not going to be the same ability to make profit as an agriculture industry on these food products. So I think that's one of the really big shifts. I think the second big shift also is going to be around health concerns in wealthier countries, where consumers are going to start realizing the very severe health consequences of our diets and start shifting to want to pursue healthier options. We already see this to some degree, but I think it's going to continue to expand as more people understand the links between their food choices and their health outcomes.
Yeah. That last one is promising. The first one is a bit on the negative side.
Yeah, it is.
Reality, no?
Yeah.
It's reality. And maybe the internal optimist in me sees that these types of shocks are the biggest opportunities for change. It is the moments in which people start to fundamentally question the status quo and start to consider alternatives in a way that they never have before. And we've seen this in other points in history where there's shocks to our political system or there's natural disasters that create conversations that wouldn't have happened. And while it's awful that it's going to be through absolute disaster, I do have a lot of optimism that these shocks will open up points of transformation that would have never happened.
Yeah. Well, I hope that there are going to be a better future. I hope that in 10 years we have less of these climate problems but also health problems, and they are intertwined. I think on this, I don't know if you have an ending one, but we have always this ending in the podcast that we give the opportunity to our guests to ask us a question, because we fired a lot of questions to you, Sarah.
Such an amazing opportunity. I think my question to you all is, you've done a lot of interviews on this podcast and it's focused on the future of food. Maybe very short answers is, do you believe things will change? Having heard lots of different opinions and my perspective on the possibility of change, do you think our food system will change?
Our food system. I think that I see different food systems, and I believe that there will be changes. Yes, like I have a good view on what can change here in Europe, especially in the Netherlands. But like what would change in Africa? Like we had some talks with people from there, but that seems to be still far away from what we are looking at here in the Western, or what we are debating here in the Western, right? So there will be changes, maybe not in the same direction, but here in Europe and stuff, I think it's going in a good direction, especially around health, the generation where we are in, but also under our yeah, that they are really looking into their own health. You see it in the alcohol consumption. Like lately, I saw research on that red wine in France had a decrease of 80% over 50 years. That is insane. Like because it's basically that the older generation that drank quite some, but
Yeah.
the generation that's coming doesn't really drink that much
Yeah.
as well. So yeah.
Yeah, from my point of view, I think it will change. I think that it's going to be slower than what we would like to, unless there are like these situations that you were mentioning, Sarah, that in the end, humanity tend to be really reactive more than proactive, I would say. So when we see the problem, really, then is when the solutions are taken. And I try to think from my perspective in the last 26 years that I've been a human being, and I wonder if the food system has changed a lot. And I think it is done, but those changes happen more in the, like, let's say in the invisible part, more in the production, more in how the food is produced, better than in the way that we are gonna eat. And how, in some way, I would like it that is like that. That it's not a matter of new products; it's a matter of new perspective of eating. I don't hope that it changes in the terms of what is in the supermarkets, but more in the what is the normal thing to eat. And I believe that that will change. I'm not sure when, but for the reason that for different reasons such as global warming, climate change, and as well as very difficult challenges that we face as humanity, I think that it's going to change, and it's going to change for a better food system.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, I'm glad you share some optimism.
And also the last question we always do to all of our guests is a very easy one, a positive note to do this discussion. Is, Sarah, what is your favorite food or dish?
So, favorite food is one thing. The food I eat the most of, I eat the same thing for breakfast every day, which is embarrassing. I should feel like I should be more interesting than that. But I eat toast with peanut butter and apple on it every day. And I eat it a lot. Like, it's my go-to snack. It's very American, right? To eat a lot of peanut butter. But it's
also Dutch though.
It's true. It's because the first time I saw it was...
My favorite product is peanut butter.
Nice. I don't even buy like the nice stuff. I eat the crappy, basic peanut butter.
Okay.
I should know better, but it's just my favorite. And so, yeah, I eat peanut butter toast with apple every morning.
The first time I had that for breakfast was I went as an exchange student to the US, and I remember that was a recurring one.
Yeah. Okay. I'm not alone.
It was the first time I also tried peanut butter, and I remember I got like a super big pot of peanut butter back to Spain. I was like, oh, this is...
It's good. It's good. It's filling. It's got protein. It's got everything you need. Yeah.
It's true. Well, Sarah, thanks a lot for this conversation. I think it's been super insightful. Both Seko and I, we had a blast. It's been really funny, to be honest, in the sense of the insights that you were providing, and I think really stimulating for us. Thanks a lot for all of that. We wish you all the luck with Till Collective. You are in a really, I would say, honorable mission that you're following, and we can only wish you the best of success with it.
Thank you both so much for having me. This has been a blast, and really appreciate the thoughtful questions and all your work to create more space for these types of conversations.